Now they call? Ooh, too late.
I used to believe that words were just fleeting sounds when people got angry. Temporary noise that meant nothing once emotions cooled down. But sometimes, a single sentence can hit harder than any physical blow. Sometimes, one moment can completely unravel everything you thought was real about your life and relationships. Why don't you just disappear? Sarah's voice cut through our dinner table's silence like a razor blade. She wasn't screaming or throwing one of her old childhood tantrums like she used to when she was younger. No, this was entirely different and more chilling. Her voice was eerily calm, precise and calculated, like she'd been rehearsing this exact moment for weeks. And then came the devastating killing blow for my wife Emma that shattered everything. We'd honestly be better off without you here. At first, I genuinely thought I'd misheard her words completely. Maybe Sarah's harsh statement had shaken me so badly that my mind was filling in conversational gaps that weren't actually there. But no, I hadn't misunderstood anything. Emma's tone was measured, steady, and deliberate. She didn't say it during a heated argument or throw her fork down dramatically on the table. She didn't storm off in a fit of rage or raise her voice. She just stated it like it was an undeniable fact, like she'd already made up her mind about my place in this family. I stared at her across our familiar dinner table, waiting desperately for her to take it back, to soften the blow somehow, to do something, anything, to show she didn't actually mean those crushing words. But Emma just picked up her wineglass with deliberate slowness, took a measured sip, and completely avoided making any eye contact with me. The entire atmosphere in our dining room changed in that single instant, becoming heavy and oppressive. Have you ever noticed how silence isn't simply the absence of sound? Sometimes silence becomes this heavy, oppressive weight that presses down hard on your chest and makes normal breathing feel almost impossible. That's exactly what this particular silence felt like, suffocating and thick with unspoken truths hanging in the air between us. I looked directly at Sarah, 17 years old, my daughter not through biological connection, but through years of conscious choice and deliberate effort on my part. She was 12 when I married Emma. Already naturally headstrong and understandably skeptical of any new male figure entering her mother's life. I had spent countless years earning her trust through patient consistency and genuine care, late-night conversations about books she was reading for school assignments, movie nights where she pretended not to enjoy my admittedly terrible dad jokes, helping with challenging homework when she struggled but was too proud to ask her mom for assistance. All those years of carefully building our relationship had apparently been completely wiped away by a few carefully chosen, devastating words. I could have fought back immediately and aggressively, could have demanded a detailed explanation for this sudden hostility toward me, could have reminded them both of all the countless times I'd been reliably present when Marcus, the man who contributed DNA but absolutely nothing else meaningful to Sarah's upbringing, had disappeared for years at a time without any explanation or warning. But I chose not to say a single word in my own defense. I simply stood up from my chair, the wooden legs scraping loudly against our hardwood floor, and walked deliberately upstairs. The uncomfortable weight of their stares followed me as I moved through the house we'd shared as a family for 5 years. Part of me desperately wanted to turn around, to catch even a flicker of regret in Emma's expression, or see if Sarah looked shocked by the severity of what had just happened. But I absolutely refused to give them that particular satisfaction. I walked into our master bedroom, grabbed my old military duffel bag from the very back of our walk-in closet, and began packing methodically, not frantically or mindlessly throwing things around, just carefully and deliberately selecting what I'd need. I wasn't storming out in some dramatic fit of rage, randomly grabbing whatever I could find and shoving it into a suitcase. No, I was packing with very specific purpose and clear intention about what might happen next. A few work shirts, enough clean clothes to last several days away from home. My toothbrush, phone charger, passport, just in case the situation became more complicated than I anticipated. As I packed with deliberate precision, I noticed something genuinely strange about my current emotional state. My hands weren't shaking at all, not even slightly. I had always assumed that if my marriage ever reached this particular breaking point, I'd be a complete emotional wreck, pleading desperately with them, breaking down completely, trying frantically to fix whatever had gone so terribly wrong between us. But I wasn't reacting that way at all. I was unnaturally calm about the entire situation. Too calm, actually, which worried me slightly. Downstairs, I could hear hushed voices carrying up through the floorboards. Sarah's heavy, dramatic footsteps as she stomped off to her bedroom in typical teenage fashion. The familiar clinking of dishes and silverware as Emma cleared our dinner table like absolutely nothing extraordinary had just occurred. But most significantly, no one came upstairs to check on me. No one made any attempt to stop what was clearly happening. The crushing realization hit me like a physical blow to my gut. They genuinely didn't care whether I stayed or left permanently. They weren't expecting me to fight back or defend myself against their accusations. They weren't expecting me to try desperately to salvage our family unit. And for the first time in my entire adult life, I truly felt like a complete outsider in what I had believed was my own home. I zipped up the duffel bag with finality, slung it over my shoulder, and made my way downstairs one last time. Emma was leaning casually against our kitchen counter with her arms crossed defensively, her facial expression completely unreadable. Not angry, not regretful, not sad or conflicted, just patiently waiting to see exactly what I would do next. "So you're really just leaving like this?" she asked with what sounded like mild, detached curiosity. "You clearly stated you'd be better off without me," I replied calmly, patting my pocket to make sure I had my car keys. "I'm simply respecting that decision and giving you what you want." Her lips parted slightly like she was about to say something potentially important, but then she stopped herself mid-thought. Was it stubborn pride holding her back, overwhelming guilt, or maybe she was just too damn stubborn to admit she might not have actually meant those cutting words? I walked deliberately to our front door and gripped the brass handle firmly. Before leaving permanently, I turned to look at Emma one final time. "You know," I said quietly but clearly, "when Sarah said those things earlier, it hurt me deeply. But hearing you agree with her assessment, that broke something fundamental inside me that I'm not sure can be repaired." Emma blinked exactly once. Just once. No sharp retort or comeback. No characteristically biting comment. No attempt at explanation or clarification. Just complete, heavy silence hanging between us. I opened the door and stepped out into the cold night air. The temperature hit me like a physical slap across the face, but I genuinely welcomed the harsh sensation. It felt more real and honest than anything that had happened during the last hour inside our house. I got into my car and drove away without once looking back toward the home I was leaving behind. It wasn't until I pulled into my close friend Jake's driveway that the full reality of my situation really hit me with devastating force. This wasn't just a bad fight that would blow over by morning. This wasn't just one particularly difficult evening that we'd all regret and apologize for later. I might never return to that house again as a family member. And the most genuinely frightening part of this entire realization was that I wasn't entirely sure I actually wanted to go back. Waking up in an unfamiliar bed the following morning wasn't the worst part of this new reality I found myself in. The worst part was the absolute crushing silence surrounding me on all sides. Have you ever noticed how a house sounds completely different depending on who's actually living in it? Even during the deepest sleep, a real home feels alive and warm with subtle, comforting sounds. Soft breathing from nearby bedrooms, the gentle creak of someone shifting under covers during the night, the quiet hum of kitchen appliances running automatically, the whisper of heating systems kicking in throughout the house. But Jake's guest room was eerily, unnaturally silent, not peaceful or comforting in any way, just empty and hollow and lifeless. I stared at the unfamiliar ceiling for what felt like hours, replaying the previous night's devastating events over and over again in my head like a broken record stuck on repeat. "Why don't you just disappear?" And "we'd be better off without you," kept echoing relentlessly in my mind. Those words had settled deep into my chest like heavy stones, pressing down harder and more painfully with every breath I attempted to take. I thought maybe in the harsh, unforgiving light of day, the emotional pain would hurt less somehow. Maybe I'd wake up to genuinely apologetic texts from Emma saying she didn't mean any of it. Maybe Sarah would have second thoughts overnight and reach out with regret. I rolled over heavily and grabbed my phone from the unfamiliar nightstand. 27 missed calls total. Emma had called 15 separate times. Sarah had called 12 times. Even my sister Kate had called, which was unusual since she typically stayed out of family drama unless absolutely necessary. I exhaled slowly, feeling a confusing mix of conflicting emotions washing over me. I should have felt relieved, right? If they were calling this desperately and repeatedly, it obviously meant something significant had changed overnight. Maybe genuine regret had finally set in. Maybe Emma had realized the full severity of what she'd said to me. Maybe Sarah had seen my conspicuously empty chair at the breakfast table and felt authentic guilt. Maybe. But something about the entire situation felt fundamentally wrong to me. Emma wasn't typically the type of person who'd call 15 times unless something genuinely serious was happening. Kate definitely wasn't the type to get involved in our family drama unless she absolutely felt she had to intervene. A distinctly bad feeling started crawling up my spine like ice water. I sat up in the unfamiliar bed and pulled on my jeans, which were still wrinkled and creased from yesterday's wear. Jake was already awake and active in his kitchen when I emerged from the guest room, casually scrolling through his phone with a steaming cup of coffee in his free hand. "You look like absolute hell," he said without bothering to look up from his phone screen. "Good morning to you too," I muttered sarcastically, reaching for a clean mug from his cabinet. He finally glanced at me with what appeared to be genuine concern. "You check your phone yet this morning?" "Yeah, I did," I replied, pouring myself coffee from his pot. 27 missed calls total. Jake raised a skeptical eyebrow. "You call anyone back yet?" I shook my head firmly. "Not yet. I'm not ready for that conversation." He studied my face carefully for a long moment, then turned his phone around and deliberately slid it across the counter directly toward me. I stared at his screen, not immediately processing exactly what I was looking at. It was some kind of social media post, a photograph of a smiling, well-dressed man sitting comfortably at what appeared to be an upscale restaurant table tagged at some expensive location in Denver, Colorado. The caption was deceptively simple and innocent. "Reunited at last. Family is everything." And there, sitting right beside him with the most radiant, genuinely happy smile I'd seen from her in many months, was Sarah, looking more joyful and content than she had in ages. The man sitting beside her, with his arm around her shoulders possessively, was Marcus, her biological father. I blinked hard and looked at the image again, my stomach twisting into uncomfortable knots. "When exactly was this posted?" I asked, my voice coming out unusually low and controlled. "Last night," Jake said, taking another deliberate sip of his coffee. "Based on his other recent posts, looks like he's been back in town for quite a while now." I stared intently at Sarah's face in the photograph. She had that distinctive, hopeful expression she used to get when she thought something truly amazing was about to happen in her life. Like when she got accepted to that highly competitive summer academic program last year, or when I finally taught her to parallel park properly and she nailed it perfectly on her first real attempt. She was looking at Marcus with that exact same expression of pure, unbridled joy and anticipation, like he was the answer to every prayer she'd ever made, like he hadn't systematically and repeatedly abandoned her for years at a time throughout her childhood. I scrolled down through more recent posts on his profile, my grip tightening dangerously on Jake's phone. The comments section was filled with heart emojis and friends saying supportive things like, "So happy for you both," and "finally together again," and "this is beautiful." These people commenting had absolutely no idea what they were actually celebrating. They didn't know that Marcus had missed 6 consecutive birthdays without explanation. They didn't know he'd promised Sarah an elaborate, expensive beach vacation when she was 10 years old and then simply never showed up or followed through. They didn't know that the last time he'd made a dramatic reappearance in her life, he'd stayed for exactly 2 weeks before vanishing again without any warning or explanation. And Emma had not only allowed this reunion to happen, she'd kept it completely secret from me. I opened my call log and hovered uncertainly over Emma's name, every instinct telling me I should call immediately and demand a detailed explanation of what was happening behind my back. But I didn't make that call just yet. Instead, I did something I honestly hadn't done in many months. I checked Sarah's Instagram account directly. Her most recent post was a selfie with Marcus, both of them grinning widely at the camera. The caption read simply, "Real family time, finally." I inhaled sharply, feeling like I'd been punched directly in the stomach. My grip tightened dangerously on the phone. Real family. The implications of those specific words were absolutely crystal clear and intentionally hurtful. I wasn't visible anywhere in her recent photos. I scrolled backward methodically through weeks and weeks of posts, past old cherished memories, past birthday celebration pictures, past vacation snapshots from trips we'd taken together as a family. It took me far too long to realize what was fundamentally wrong with everything I was seeing. I wasn't present in any of these photos, not a single one. Even photographs I knew with absolute certainty I had been part of originally. The family trip to Yellowstone National Park last summer, where I'd personally taken half the pictures myself. Christmas morning by our beautifully decorated tree, where I'd helped Sarah wrap presents for her mother. Her 16th birthday party that I'd spent weeks carefully planning and organizing. I was completely and utterly gone from all of them. Not just untagged from the social media posts, physically removed from the actual images through careful photo editing software. A hollow, sickening feeling settled deep in my chest like a lead weight. This wasn't simply about last night's heated argument. This wasn't typical teenage anger or standard rebellion against parental authority. This was systematic, deliberate erasure of my entire existence in her documented life. I set Jake's phone down very carefully on the kitchen counter. My coffee had gone completely cold while I'd been scrolling through the devastating evidence. I pushed the mug aside, no longer interested in drinking anything. Jake must have noticed something genuinely alarming in my facial expression because his casual demeanor immediately shifted to serious concern. "You doing okay there, man?" I exhaled slowly and very deliberately. "No, not even remotely close to okay." He nodded like he'd fully expected that exact answer. "You gonna call Emma back?" Emma's name was still prominently displayed on my phone screen. I stared at it for several long seconds, then looked back at Sarah's Instagram account. Real family time stared back at me mockingly. I made a decision that would ultimately change everything about this situation. I slid the phone back across the counter toward Jake and stood up decisively from my chair. "I'm going home," I announced with complete firmness. Jake didn't try to stop me or offer unsolicited advice about the situation. He understood intuitively that this was something I absolutely had to handle myself, because this time I wasn't going back for them or to try desperately to salvage our deteriorating relationship. I was going back to see what, if anything, was left of the man I used to be in that house. The drive home felt significantly longer than usual, despite the familiar route I'd traveled thousands of times before. No radio playing in the background, no traffic sounds that penetrated my intense focus, just the steady rhythmic sound of my thoughts circling the same devastating realization over and over again. I had been systematically and deliberately erased from Sarah's life, not just temporarily forgotten during a difficult argument, not just momentarily ignored during a challenging family period, completely and utterly erased from her personal history. Sarah hadn't simply stopped talking to me or started avoiding family activities and gatherings. She had actively and intentionally rewritten our entire shared past together. The vacations we'd taken as a family, the birthdays we'd celebrated together, the countless small but meaningful moments that had built our relationship carefully over 5 years, all gone without a single trace remaining. And Emma had not only allowed this systematic erasure to happen, she had actively participated by keeping Marcus's return completely secret from me for what appeared to be months. The closer I got to our house, the tighter the anxious knot in my stomach became. I had absolutely no idea what I was walking into. Were they waiting expectantly for me to return? Had Sarah even noticed I'd been gone overnight? Did Emma regret anything she'd said during our confrontation? Or was she already actively imagining and planning a future where I simply didn't exist in their lives? I pulled into our familiar driveway and sat in my car for several long moments, staring at the house I'd called home for 5 years. Nothing looked different or unusual from the outside perspective. The lawn was still neatly maintained and well trimmed. The porch lights were still on exactly as I'd left them. A complete stranger passing by on the street wouldn't guess that the man inside had been told he was completely disposable and unwanted less than 24 hours ago. I stepped out of my car, pocketed my keys, and walked up the familiar path to our front door. My fingers hesitated on the door handle for just a moment. I wasn't coming back to beg desperately for forgiveness. I wasn't coming back to argue my case or defend my past actions. I just needed to see the situation with complete clarity, to confirm what I already suspected deep in my heart was true. When I stepped inside our house, I was immediately greeted by that same heavy, unnatural silence from the night before. Not comfortable or peaceful in any way, but expectant and waiting, like the house itself was holding its breath. And then I saw something that made my blood run genuinely cold. The wall of family photographs in our living room told the complete, devastating story. I'd noticed some missing pictures before, but now, standing directly in front of the display, the full scope of the damage was even worse than I'd imagined possible. It wasn't just a few missing frames scattered here and there. I had been deliberately and systematically cut out of our documented family history, one photograph at a time. Every single shared moment had been carefully altered to completely erase my presence. The Yellowstone trip where I'd been standing directly next to Sarah at the scenic overlook. Now there was just an awkward, obvious gap in the composition. Christmas morning where Sarah had been sitting right beside me unwrapping the book she'd begged for all year. Now the image looked fundamentally wrong and incomplete, like someone had been carefully cropped out of the frame using photo editing software. I took a step backward, my breathing steady, but my hands involuntarily clenching into tight fists at my sides. This level of deliberate, systematic erasure wasn't accidental or spontaneous. This was completely intentional and had been carefully planned for weeks, possibly even months. The wooden floorboards above me creaked softly. A bedroom door clicked shut with deliberate quiet. Sarah was definitely home and had clearly heard me come inside. I stood perfectly still, listening carefully to the subtle sounds of the house around me. For a long moment, there was complete, heavy silence. Then, after what seemed like very careful consideration on her part, I heard her footsteps moving deliberately toward the stairs. I turned just in time to see her coming down slowly, phone clutched tightly in her hand, eyes deliberately avoiding mine completely. She didn't greet me or acknowledge my presence in any way whatsoever. She just walked past me like I was completely invisible, heading directly toward the kitchen. "Good morning," I said evenly, keeping my voice carefully neutral and non-confrontational. She paused for exactly 1 second, her step faltering almost imperceptibly. Then, without bothering to look directly at me, she muttered, "Morning." The tension in the air between us was almost physically unbearable. 5 years of carefully building trust and genuine connection, of being consistently present and reliable when her biological father repeatedly failed and disappointed her. And this is exactly where all that patient effort had led us. "That's quite a few calls you made last night," I continued, maintaining the same carefully neutral tone. Finally, she glanced at me with a mixture of defiance and visible discomfort. "Mom told me I had to call you." So the desperate repeated calling hadn't been her own idea after all. Of course not. She'd simply been following Emma's specific instructions, not acting on her own guilt or genuine regret about the situation. Sarah shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot, gripping her phone like it was some kind of lifeline or security blanket. I decided to cut straight to the heart of the matter. "How long has this been going on?" I asked directly and clearly. She frowned, attempting to play dumb. "What do you mean exactly?" "The photographs, the systematic erasure. How long have you been deliberately removing me from our family history?" She looked at me fully now, and there it was. The same stubborn defiance I'd witnessed the night before. But underneath that defensive exterior, I caught something else. Something smaller and more vulnerable. Guilt, maybe. Or the first genuine hints of uncertainty about her actions. "A while," she admitted reluctantly, unable to maintain direct eye contact. "Before last night's argument?" She nodded slowly, still looking away from me. I let that crucial information sink in completely. So this hadn't been a spontaneous reaction to our dinner table confrontation. This hadn't been an impulsive teenage outburst triggered by momentary anger. She had been systematically preparing for my complete removal from her life for weeks, or possibly months, carefully erasing all evidence of our relationship. My phone buzzed against the passenger seat with a voicemail from an unknown number. I hesitated, then decided to listen. "Hello, this is Mrs. Patterson, Sarah's guidance counselor at Westfield High School. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." The woman's voice was unfamiliar, but distinctly professional and concerned. "I wanted to reach out because I've noticed some very concerning recent changes in Sarah's academic planning that I felt you should know about immediately." My grip on the phone tightened automatically. "Changes in her academic planning?" Mrs. Patterson's recorded voice continued with obvious worry. "As of yesterday afternoon, Sarah submitted official withdrawal forms for all her advanced placement classes. She's also dropped French club and student government completely. When I asked her about these sudden decisions, she said she's transferring schools next semester. I nearly dropped the phone in shock. Sarah was planning to transfer schools? This was absolutely the first I'd heard of any such drastic plan. She's specifically requested that her academic transcripts be sent to 3 different schools in Denver, Colorado. Her mother signed all the necessary paperwork, so I initially assumed this was a coordinated family decision. But given how sudden and dramatic these changes are, and how they go against everything Sarah has worked toward academically, I felt I should reach out to you directly." My stomach twisted into painful knots. Denver, where Marcus was apparently living now. This couldn't possibly be coincidence. I called Mrs. Patterson back immediately, my hands shaking slightly as I dialed. Thank you so much for calling back, she said when she recognized my voice. I was hoping we could discuss Sarah's sudden academic changes in detail. What exactly did she tell you about this opportunity? I asked, trying to keep my voice level and controlled. She was quite vague about specifics, but she mentioned something about a business opportunity, some kind of startup company. She said her father has connections that could help her advance faster than traditional college preparation. I laughed, but there was absolutely no humor in the sound, just bitter recognition of Marcus's standard operating procedure. Let me guess. Her father's startup company? Yes, exactly. You sound like you have serious concerns about this. Mrs. Patterson, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest based on your professional experience. Do you think Sarah is making these decisions because she genuinely believes they're in her best interests? Or do you think she's being manipulated? There was a thoughtful pause while she considered her answer very carefully. Then, quietly but firmly, I think she's being manipulated. That was absolutely all I needed to hear. I drove back to the house with grim determination. Emma's car was already in the driveway when I arrived. I knocked firmly on our front door. Emma opened the door after a moment, arms crossed defensively, eyes guarded and suspicious. You came back, she observed without emotion. I pushed past her into the house. Where's Sarah right now? She's out somewhere, Emma said, closing the door behind me. What's this about? I turned to face her directly. You tell me, Emma, because I just spoke with Mrs. Patterson, and she tells me our daughter is dropping out of everything and transferring to Denver. Emma's carefully controlled expression faltered for just a second before she quickly rebuilt her defensive walls. I was going to tell you about that situation. When exactly? My voice was sharp now. When she was already gone. Emma sighed heavily and rubbed her temples like she had a severe headache. The situation is more complicated than you understand. How long have you known Marcus was back in town? I interrupted firmly. How long have you known he's been talking to Sarah regularly? How long have you known he's been filling her head with lies about our family? Emma's lips pressed together in a tight line. She looked away, completely unable to meet my eyes directly. A few months, she finally admitted reluctantly. My stomach dropped like a stone. Months? I took a slow step closer to her. And you didn't think I had a fundamental right to know? You didn't think I deserved to understand what was happening in my own house? Emma lifted her chin defiantly. I thought I could handle the situation myself without involving you. You thought you could handle Marcus? I couldn't keep the complete disbelief out of my voice. The same man who stole $20,000 from you? The same man who lied to Sarah repeatedly, abandoned her countless times, disappeared for years without any explanation? You really believed he just wanted to be a responsible father now? Emma hesitated, and I could see genuine uncertainty creeping into her expression for the first time. I called my sister Kate first. She answered on the second ring, her voice tight with concern. Thank God you're calling back. I've been worried sick about this whole situation. Kate, I need a favor, a big one. Is this about Sarah and that situation with her biological father? Yes, and it's much worse than you know. There was silence on the other end. Then, what do you need from me? Connections. Someone who can help me take Marcus down legally and permanently. Kate didn't hesitate. I know someone at the Securities and Exchange Commission. If Marcus is running investment fraud schemes, they can investigate and prosecute. My grip on the phone tightened with hope. That's exactly what he's doing. He's trying to get Sarah and her friend's parents to invest in some fake startup company. The legal process took several months, but Marcus eventually pled guilty to multiple counts of fraud. He received 5 years in federal prison. Sarah testified about his manipulation tactics and used the experience as the foundation for a college essay about recognizing psychological misuse and standing up for truth. She got into her first-choice school with a full academic scholarship. Emma and I went to couples counseling to work through the serious trust issues. She'd been terrified of losing Sarah entirely and thought she could handle Marcus alone. We're still together, stronger for surviving this ordeal. Sarah's relationship with me is different now, more mature, more real. She knows I'm not going anywhere. That real family means protection. Sometimes the people who love you have to be the bad guy to keep you safe. Marcus tried to friend request me on Facebook from prison. Some people never learn.